The real estate agent never mentioned the scratching sounds that came from beneath the floorboards every night. She also never mentioned that the previous owner had left in such a hurry that half his belongings were still scattered around the house. But what bothered me most was discovering that basement door 3 weeks after I'd moved in. I should have known something was wrong when I got the cabin for $30,000 below asking price. The agent, Mrs. Henderson, kept fidgeting with her car keys during the walkthrough and barely spent 10 minutes showing me around. She handed me the keys with shaking hands and drove off so fast her tires kicked up gravel that hit my truck. The cabin sat on 40 acres of dense pine forest in the Colorado Rockies. I'd bought it sight unseen online after my divorce finalized and my job went remote. The photos showed a cozy 2-bedroom log home with a stone fireplace and wraparound porch. What they didn't show was how the trees seemed to lean in toward the house, or how the silence up there felt heavy and wrong. I spent my first week unpacking boxes and getting used to the isolation. The nearest neighbor was 12 miles down a winding dirt road, and cell service was spotty at best. During the day, everything seemed normal enough. I'd work from my laptop at the kitchen table, listening to the wind in the pines and feeling proud of my escape from city life. But the nights were different. That's when I first heard the scratching. It started soft, like mice in the walls. Just little skittering sounds that I figured came from the cabin settling, or maybe some small animals that had gotten inside during the vacant months. I'd lie in bed, listening to it move back and forth beneath the floorboards of the living room. The sound followed a pattern. 3 quick scratches, pause. 3 more scratches, pause. By the end of my second week, the scratching had gotten louder. It wasn't mice anymore. The sounds were deliberate, purposeful, like something was trying to claw its way up through the floor. I started sleeping with headphones on, but even with music playing, I could feel the vibrations through the mattress. During my 3rd week, I decided to investigate the crawl space under the house. I grabbed a flashlight and crawled underneath the cabin on my hands and knees, expecting to find evidence of animals, or maybe some loose floorboards. Instead, I found something that made my stomach drop. There were deep gouges in the wooden support beams directly under the living room floor. The scratches were too big for any animal I could think of, carved in sets of 3 parallel lines that went down several inches into the wood. Some of the scratches were old and dark, but others looked fresh, with wood shavings scattered beneath them on the ground. I spent the rest of that day examining every inch of the cabin's interior, looking for any opening or access point I might have missed. The main floor had the living room, kitchen, and 1 bedroom. Upstairs was a loft bedroom and small bathroom. I checked behind every piece of furniture, looked for hidden panels in the walls, even pulled up the area rugs to examine the floorboards. That's when I found it. Behind the water heater in the utility closet, there was a door I'd somehow overlooked. It was painted the same color as the wall and had no handle, just a small metal latch that was barely visible unless you were looking for it. The door was maybe 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, like it was designed for someone crawling through. I pulled the latch and the door swung open with a squeal of old hinges. Cold air rushed out, carrying a smell that made me step back. It wasn't quite rotting, but it was organic and wrong, like wet earth mixed with something sour. My flashlight beam revealed wooden stairs leading down into darkness. The previous owner, according to Mrs. Henderson, was named Dale Emmett. He'd lived in the cabin for 15 years before putting it on the market without warning. When I asked why he was selling, she just said he'd moved out of state for family reasons. Now, standing at the top of those basement stairs, I wondered what Dale had been running from. I should have closed that door and left it alone. Should have packed my things and driven back to Denver that same day. Instead, I grabbed a stronger flashlight and started down those stairs. The basement was bigger than the cabin's footprint, extending out under what must have been the surrounding yard. The walls were rough stone, and the floor was packed dirt that felt soft under my boots. My flashlight picked out wooden support posts scattered throughout the space, and I could see where the scratches continued down here, carved into the posts and even gouged into the stone walls. But what caught my attention were the chains. Heavy metal chains were bolted into the stone walls at various points around the basement. Some hung loose while others were stretched tight and connected to metal stakes driven deep into the dirt floor. The chains showed signs of wear, with deep scratches in the metal links and dark stains I didn't want to think about. In the far corner, I found Dale's workbench. It was covered with tools I didn't recognize, strange metal implements with sharp edges and curved hooks. There were also notebooks filled with Dale's handwriting, detailing dates and times and measurements. The entries went back years, chronicling something he called feeding schedules and growth patterns. I flipped through the notebooks with growing unease. Dale had been documenting something that lived down here, something that required regular feeding and had been growing larger over time. The early entries mentioned it being the size of a house cat, but the most recent ones described it as nearly human-sized and showing increased aggression. The last entry was dated just 2 days before Dale put the cabin on the market. It simply read, "It's gotten too strong for the chains. Moving out tomorrow. God help whoever buys this place." I dropped the notebook and backed toward the stairs, my flashlight beam dancing wildly around the basement. That's when I heard it, a wet sliding sound coming from somewhere deeper in the darkness. My light couldn't penetrate the far reaches of the basement, and I realized there might be tunnels or rooms I hadn't seen. The sliding sound got closer, accompanied by a low clicking noise, like someone rapidly tapping their fingernails on wood. I ran up those stairs so fast I scraped my knee on the stone wall, slammed the door behind me, and shoved the water heater in front of it. That night, the scratching under the floorboards was the loudest it had ever been. It went on for hours, accompanied by that same clicking sound I'd heard in the basement. I sat in my truck until dawn, engine running, debating whether to just drive away and never come back. But I'd put everything I had into buying this place. My divorce had taken half my savings, and the cabin represented a fresh start I couldn't afford to abandon. When morning came and the sound stopped, I convinced myself I'd been letting my imagination run wild. Maybe Dale had been keeping some exotic pet down there, something that had died or escaped when he left. I moved the water heater back and checked the basement door. It was still latched tight. Whatever I'd heard the night before, it was contained down there. I could live with some scratching sounds if it meant keeping my new life in the mountains. For 3 days, I tried to pretend everything was normal. I worked during the day, made dinner, even called my sister to tell her how much I was enjoying mountain living. But the sounds were getting worse. The scratching had turned into what sounded like digging, and sometimes I could hear what might have been breathing through the vents. On the 4th night, I woke up to silence, complete, absolute silence. Even the usual forest sounds, the wind in the trees, the distant hoot of owls had stopped. I lay in bed straining to hear anything, and that's when I noticed the smell. That same organic, wrong smell from the basement was now seeping up through the floorboards. It was getting stronger by the minute, filling the bedroom with an odor that made my eyes water. I grabbed my flashlight and crept downstairs, following the smell to its source. The utility closet door was open. The water heater I'd pushed in front of it was now sitting 3 feet to the left, and the basement door hung wide, revealing those dark stairs descending into nothing. I should have run. Should have grabbed my keys and gotten in my truck and driven until I hit a town with streetlights and people. Instead, I found myself walking toward that open door, drawn by a curiosity that felt almost compulsive. The smell was overwhelming now, but there was something else, a soft, rhythmic sound like heavy breathing. It was coming from the basement, echoing up through the open door. I started down the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The basement looked different. The chains that had been hanging loose were now stretched tight, and I could see that some of the metal stakes had been pulled partway out of the ground. Deep furrows in the dirt floor showed where something heavy had been dragged back and forth. The scratches on the walls were deeper, some of them so fresh that stone dust still littered the ground beneath them. I followed the breathing sound toward the back of the basement, where my flashlight revealed an opening I hadn't noticed before. It looked like a natural cave that extended beyond the cabin's foundation, disappearing into the mountain itself. The breathing was coming from somewhere in that darkness. As I got closer, I started to make out other sounds, a wet, sliding noise like something dragging itself across stone. Occasional clicks and taps that reminded me of insect sounds, but much too loud. And underneath it all, something that might have been whimpering. My flashlight beam penetrated about 20 feet into the cave before the darkness swallowed it completely. The sounds were coming from somewhere beyond that range, echoing off unseen walls. I took another step forward, then another, drawn by a need to know what Dale had been keeping down here. That's when I saw the eyes. 2 pale, reflective circles floating in the darkness about 6 feet off the ground. They were too far apart to be human eyes, and they didn't blink. They just stared at me with an intensity that made my knees weak. The breathing sound got faster, more excited, and the eyes started moving closer. I backed away, my flashlight beam dancing wildly as my hands shook. The eyes followed my movement, staying at the edge of my light's reach. As they got closer, I could make out more details that my brain refused to process. The suggestion of something large and pale, moving in a way that wasn't quite walking. The whimpering sound got louder, and I realized it wasn't coming from whatever owned those eyes. It was coming from me. I turned and ran for the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. Behind me, I heard something large hitting the stone walls of the cave, followed by a sound like breaking glass. Then silence, except for my own gasping breath as I reached the main floor. I slammed the basement door and pushed the water heater back in front of it, then dragged my kitchen table over for extra weight. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the furniture. Whatever was down there had gotten loose from Dale's chains, and now it knew I was here. The scratching started again around midnight, but this time it wasn't just under the floorboards. It was coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from what sounded like everywhere at once. Something was moving through spaces I didn't know existed, following pathways Dale had never mentioned in his notebooks. I spent that night sitting in my living room with every light on, listening to the sounds of something large moving through the structure of my home. Sometimes the scratching would stop, and I'd hear that clicking noise right above my head, like it was hanging from the ceiling beams. By morning, I'd made my decision. I was leaving. I'd take the financial loss and find somewhere else to start over. I wasn't equipped to deal with whatever Dale had left behind in this place. I started packing my essentials, planning to leave most of my furniture behind, Speed was more important than saving my belongings. I could be on the road within an hour if I just took clothes and my laptop. That's when I noticed the new scratches. They were carved into my bedroom door. 3 parallel lines gouged deep into the wood. The scratches were exactly at eye level, like something had stood there studying the door before marking it. The wood shavings were still fresh on the floor beneath them. I checked every door in the cabin and found the same marks. Kitchen door, bathroom door, even the closet doors. Whatever was living in this place had been moving through my home while I slept, marking its territory. The front door was the only one without scratches, and I took that as a sign. It wanted me to know it could reach me anywhere in the cabin, but it wasn't trying to keep me from leaving. Not yet. I threw my suitcase in the truck and started the engine. The relief I felt pulling away from that cabin was overwhelming. I'd made it maybe half a mile down the dirt road when the engine started sputtering. The truck rolled to a stop in a cloud of steam from under the hood. I popped it open and found that someone, or something, had torn out half the engine components. Wires were shredded, hoses were cut clean through, and fluid was leaking everywhere. The damage looked deliberate, methodical, like it had been done by something that understood how engines worked. I grabbed my phone, hoping for enough signal to call for help, but the screen was cracked. Not just cracked. It looked like something with claws had deliberately destroyed it. I remembered leaving it on the kitchen counter the night before. Walking back to the cabin felt like a death sentence, but I didn't have a choice. It was 12 miles to the nearest neighbor through dense forest, and night was falling fast. I'd have to figure out another plan in the morning. The cabin looked different as I approached. The windows that had been dark when I left were now glowing with warm light, like someone was home waiting for me. I knew I'd turned off all the lights before leaving, and I definitely hadn't left the front door standing wide open. I stood at the edge of the porch, staring into that open doorway. The smart thing would be to sleep in the woods, maybe try to hike out in the morning. But the temperature was dropping, and I could hear things moving in the forest around me. At least the cabin offered walls and a roof. I stepped inside and immediately knew I wasn't alone. The furniture had been moved. My kitchen table was now in the center of the living room, with one of the chairs pulled out like someone had been sitting there waiting. The scratching sounds were gone, replaced by an expectant silence that felt worse than any noise. I walked through the cabin, turning on lights and checking each room. Everything looked normal except for the moved furniture and the smell. That organic, wrong smell was everywhere now, so thick I could taste it. In my bedroom, I found a new notebook on the pillow. It was identical to the ones Dale had left in the basement, with the same handwriting on the cover. Feeding schedule, new owner. Inside, someone had written detailed observations about my daily routine. What time I woke up, what I ate for breakfast, how long I worked at my laptop. The entries went back to my first day in the cabin, documenting my every move with scientific precision. The final entry was dated today. Subject attempted to leave. Vehicle disabled. Subject returned as expected. Beginning final phase. I dropped the notebook and backed toward the bedroom door. That's when I heard footsteps in the living room. Slow, deliberate steps that were too heavy to be human, but followed a human rhythm. The footsteps stopped, and I could hear breathing from the other side of my bedroom door. Not the ragged breathing I'd heard in the basement, but calm, patient breathing, like something was waiting for me to make the next move. I looked around the bedroom for another way out. The window was too small to climb through, and it was a 15-foot drop to the ground anyway. I was trapped with whatever was standing outside my door. The breathing stopped and I heard the doorknob slowly turning. I pressed myself against the far wall as the door swung open, revealing the empty hallway beyond. But the smell got stronger, and I could hear something moving just out of sight. The floorboards creaked under weight that seemed to shift and redistribute in ways that didn't make sense. Then I saw it. Not clearly. My mind still refuses to put together a complete picture of what stood in that doorway, but I caught glimpses as it moved into the room. Pale skin that looked almost transparent in places, limbs that were too long and bent at wrong angles, and those eyes, the same pale circles I'd seen in the basement, but now I could see they weren't quite eyes at all. It moved toward me with that sliding, wrong motion I'd heard in the basement. As it got closer, I could see more details that made my vision blur around the edges. The way its skin seemed to shift and ripple. The sounds it made that were almost like words but not quite human. It stopped just close enough that I could feel the cold radiating from its body. When it spoke, its voice was like Dale's voice, played backwards and underwater. "You can't leave," it said. Each word stretched and distorted. Dale tried to leave. Dale came back. You'll come back too. I realized then that Dale hadn't sold the cabin and moved away. Dale was still here, somewhere in this thing that was wearing pieces of his voice. This creature had been feeding on him for 15 years, and now it was my turn. The basement is too small now, it continued, tilting its head in a way that made my stomach lurch. I've grown. I need the whole mountain. But I need someone to take care of me. Someone to bring me what I need. It reached toward me with something that might have been a hand, and I could see that its skin was covered in the same scratches that marked the walls and posts, like it had been clawing at itself, trying to shed something that wouldn't come off. Dale was a good caretaker for many years, but Dale got old. Dale got scared. You're younger. You'll last longer. I pressed myself harder against the wall, but there was nowhere left to go. The thing leaned closer, and I could see my reflection multiplied in what passed for its eyes. "Don't worry," it whispered, with Dale's ruined voice. "It doesn't hurt much after the first few times, and you'll learn to like the taste eventually. Dale did." That's when I understood what the feeding schedule had really been about. Dale hadn't been feeding this thing. This thing had been feeding on Dale, slowly consuming him piece by piece over 15 years until there was nothing left but echoes in a monster's throat. The creature reached for me again, and I did the only thing I could think of. I threw myself sideways through the bedroom window. The glass exploded around me as I crashed through, and I hit the ground hard enough to knock the wind out of my lungs. Above me, I could hear the thing moving through my bedroom, making sounds like breaking furniture. I rolled under the cabin and crawled toward the forest, ignoring the pain from dozens of glass cuts. Behind me, I heard the front door slam open and those wrong footsteps on the porch. The woods were completely dark, but I knew staying near the cabin meant death. I crashed through the underbrush, following what I hoped was the dirt road by feel. Branches tore at my clothes and face, but I kept moving. I could hear it following me, crashing through the trees with more noise than anything that size should make. Sometimes the sounds would get closer, and I'd change direction, praying I wasn't getting turned around in the darkness. After what felt like hours, I saw lights ahead. Real electric lights, not the cold glow that had been coming from my cabin windows. I stumbled out of the woods onto a paved road just as a pickup truck came around the bend. The driver was a local named Tom, who'd seen my truck broken down on his way to work that morning. He'd been coming back with a friend to help me tow it out. When he saw me bleeding and half crazy, stumbling out of the forest, he didn't ask questions. He just loaded me into his truck and drove straight to the sheriff's office in town. I tried to tell them about the creature in my cabin, about Dale still being there in some horrible way, about the basement and the chains and the feeding schedule. They listened politely and took notes, but I could see in their eyes that they thought I'd had some kind of breakdown. The sheriff agreed to send someone to check on the cabin, more to humor me than because he believed my story. When the deputy came back, he reported that the cabin was empty and showed no signs of disturbance. The basement door was locked, and there were no unusual smells or sounds. They found my truck, right where I'd left it, but according to the deputy, the engine was in perfect working order. No damage, no missing parts, no sign that anyone had tampered with it. My phone was on the kitchen counter, unbroken and fully functional. The notebooks I'd seen in the basement were gone. The scratches on the walls and doors had vanished. Even the moved furniture was back in its original places. It was like none of it had ever happened. But I knew better. I knew that thing was still there, waiting in the mountain for the next person desperate enough to buy a cabin at $30,000 below asking price. It had learned to hide its traces, to make everything look normal when the authorities came around. I left Colorado that same day and never went back. I started over in Florida, as far from mountains and forests as I could get. For months, I jumped at every unexpected sound and checked my doors and windows obsessively. The nightmares eventually faded, and I almost convinced myself it had all been stress and isolation playing tricks on my mind. Almost. Then, 6 months later, I got a call from Mrs. Henderson, the real estate agent. She wanted to know if I'd be interested in giving a reference for the cabin's next potential buyer. A nice young couple from Denver, looking for a mountain retreat just like I'd been. I told her I'd moved and wasn't available for references, then hung up and blocked her number. But I couldn't stop thinking about that young couple, walking through my old cabin with Mrs. Henderson fidgeting with her car keys, getting a deal that seemed too good to be true. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if they found the basement door. I wonder if they heard the scratching and convinced themselves it was just mice. I wonder if they're still there, taking care of something that's growing bigger and hungrier with each passing year. And sometimes when the wind is just right, I swear I can still smell that organic, wrong smell that meant something unnatural was close by. When that happens, I pack a bag and stay in a hotel for a few days, just to be safe. Because I learned something important in those mountains. Some hungers are patient. Some things that feed don't mind waiting years between meals, and some purchases come with hidden costs that no amount of money can ever pay off. The cabin is still for sale, according to the real estate websites. The price keeps dropping, and the photos still show that cozy log home with the stone fireplace and wraparound porch. They never show the basement door, and they certainly don't mention what's waiting behind it. But it's there. It's always there, growing larger and more patient with each passing season, waiting for the next person who needs a fresh start badly enough to ignore the warning signs, the scratching under the floorboards, the too good price, the agent who can't wait to leave, the basement door that somehow never gets noticed until it's too late.